Our next speaker is actually also kind of has to deal with typography, but also like web typography, but also with lots of really crazy JavaScript stuff eventually. He's working in Leatherman group, right? And he's actually responsible for this WOF2 test, but also lots of other JavaScript libraries that you might have heard of. So I'm looking forward to what he has to say today. So please give a warm applause to Zach Leatherman.
All right, I got my mouse back. Sweet. How's everybody doing? Good? All right. Got my test slide. Sweet. Oh, what's going on here? Oh, there's the image. That's good. That's a good start. Oh, the image. Oh, there we go. There's our content. Do you guys ever have that problem where your content doesn't show up right away? You may have used web fonts. It's going to be good. All right, so today we're going to talk about remodeling font face. My name is Zach Leatherman. I'm Zachly on Twitter and GitHub. And I work for Filament Group, who has the ambitious goal of making the web work for everyone, which I think is really great. The things we're going to go over today is kind of the motivation behind web fonts, different formats we can use, kind of questioning some assumptions we have around there. What web fonts, what you need to do to initiate a download of your web font on your page, the behavior your web font will take while it's loading, and one weird trick that we can use to fix everything. All right, so font face. It's actually a very popular feature on the web. It's used in 45% of the top 1,000 websites. And on average, has about 68 kilobytes of payload, which is really not that big when you compare it to some of the other assets that we have on our sites, right? Images is the big one, right? You commonly hear this problem. We have over a meg on average, according to HTTP Archive, of images per page. It's a huge deal. And about 300 kilobyte of JavaScript. So why do we need to worry about web fonts? And you might have also heard this. Are you worried about your JavaScript size on your page? Just remove an image, right? No, this is wrong. Because not all requests are created equal. We need to think about what is in our critical path and how our assets have an effect on our perceived performance. So for example, when it comes to non-blocking assets, images, right? The least intrusive of assets we can include on our pages. And when we consider blocking assets on our pages, the big one is JavaScript, parsing and loading, especially if you use client-side templating. CSS, which is why we started to really talk about dividing our CSS into critical and non-critical to get those pages rendered as quickly as possible. And the lowly web font. So we're tackling web fonts, which is blocks your content, doesn't show your content while the web font is loading, and in some browsers can actually be a single point of failure if the request doesn't complete. So web fonts is a big deal. So in what's probably going to be the bravest moment of my professional career, I want to ask the audience to participate in a little stretching exercise with me, if you would. So if I could get everybody to raise their hands like this. See how cooperative everyone is? All right, nice. Now can I get you to wiggle your fingers? OK, awesome. And now if we can do just a little vocal exercise. Repeat after me. Are you ready? Nice. All right, cool. Party on. All right, we're going to flash back. It's a good segue. Oh, my gosh. Flashback to 1997. Font face was actually introduced in CSS 2.0 in 1997. That's an old web standard, right? It was introduced first in Netscape Navigator 4.0. Who had and used Netscape Navigator? Whoa, that is amazing. OK, awesome. Just to give you a little context, at the time, IE 4.0 was also available in Opera 3. This is what Wikipedia looked like, 1997. Man, what a high-quality website. And this is the site that I built in 1997. Now I'm just going to completely destroy my professional credibility right now. This is really good. I don't know if you guys noticed. It's got some rainbow buttons there, some animated GIFs. GIF. Okay. Yeah, so this is good. Okay. That actually is still live on the web, and I took that screenshot with the latest Chrome, so nice. For the web, things last forever, I guess, which is probably not good in this case, but okay, moving on. So font-based syntax has actually not changed too much since 1997. It's very simple. Obviously, you add a font family, and you have a list of font formats. And this might lead you to ask, what format should I use in my font face code block? To that, I asked my good friend and slow beach running enthusiast, oh shoot, David Hasselhoff. He'll tell you, use the WAF format, right? It's great, modern browser support, goes back a long ways. And if you want a little bit better support in Android, since we're still, right, you guys are all still supporting Android 2.3, right? No? Nobody? Just me? Okay. We'll add the OpenType format, or you can do a TrueType format. Now, a lot of people don't really understand the difference between a TrueType format and OpenType format. And I didn't before I prepared this presentation, so we all get to learn it together. OpenType format is actually a newer extension to TrueType format. Has a few more typographic features. So for example, ligatures, small caps, and a bunch of other things that you might see in font feature settings CSS property. And TTF is more likely to be something that you'd get from a generator like Font Squirrel. So it's just a little bit more ubiquitous. So if you want to see the things that are kind of available inside of an OpenType format, you can check out the documentation on Mozilla Developer Network. And then we'll show you a lot of things that you can get when you use the OpenType font format. Another great tool out there is the state of web type, something created by Bram Stein. It actually is web browser compatibility tables for these different OpenType features. But we don't want to stop at just the WAF format and the OpenType format. And if we do, we'd be committing the most common mistake in computer science. I'm off by one error. It's a good one. So we want to add the WAF2 format. So WAF2 doesn't actually buy us any new web browser support. And it's actually currently only available in Chrome and Opera, and Chrome and Android, some of the newer Blink browsers. So it doesn't actually get us anything new in browser support, but it is 30% smaller on average than your WAF format. So Google actually did a study for all their Google Web Fonts, and on average, the WAF2 format was about 30% smaller. So we'll add that to the beginning, because fonts pick the first, web browsers pick the first one and use it. And we're off to see the wizard. So if you need IE8 support, everybody that's doing Android 2.3 I assume is also supporting IE8. I actually am really curious. How many people are still supporting IE8? Okay. So it's not as bad as you guys were leading on. So you want to add the embedded OpenType format. But to that, I would actually question you to say, do you actually need that format? Because with content fonts, if it doesn't find an appropriate format, it will just use the fallback font family, which for content fonts should work fine. But for icon fonts, it's a little bit different. So today I'm going to kind of talk about two different kinds of icon fonts, your supplemental icon font and your standalone icon font. So supplemental is kind of paired with some text that kind of describes what the icon is for. So if your font doesn't load successfully, you'll still have the descriptive text. And Jen kind of went over this a little bit. And your standalone icon fonts, which if they don't load, who knows what will happen. We'll go over that a little bit later, but more risky. But content fonts and icon fonts are different use cases, so they have we should have different font stacks for that. So you might not have wanted your IE8 to have the new web font, but with icon fonts, it's more important, especially when you're using standalone fonts that don't have descriptive text paired with them. So now forget everything I said about compatibility, because when it comes to SVG fonts, we don't want to use them anymore. They're very bad. And when it comes to situations like this, I usually say, what would typekit do? www.tkd. And Bramstein works for typekit, and he said that typekit stopped serving SVG fonts a couple months ago. They only have disadvantages. So, for example, SVG fonts was removed from the SVG specification. It's no longer an official thing. Their implementation was removed from Chrome. And the asterisk says, with temporary exception to platforms still using an old text rendering API called GDI, so your Windows XP and your Windows Vista. But eventually, they will be removed permanently. And they were never supported on IE and Firefox. So the only thing that using an SVG font really bought us was BlackBerry 6, which I'm sure you guys, so this is kind of an important point, because at Filament Group, we try to make the web work for everyone, not just people that have newer Android devices or new iPhones. We actually still test on BlackBerry 6. So if you want the best job in the world, come work at Filament Group, right? Yeah, BlackBerry, okay, no. But yeah, so SVG fonts really only bought you BlackBerry 6 support and super old iOS Safari support. And iOS is usually, their users are usually really good about upgrading their browser or buying new devices because they're a little bit more first world than most. So generally, you don't have to worry about aging iOS Safari. But on BlackBerry 6, I think Liza is actually here today. I haven't met her, but she posted this great tweet about SVG font face support on BlackBerry OS 6. And I'll zoom in for you. And that's what it looks like when you're using SVG font on BlackBerry. So I would encourage you to go ahead and remove your SVG font format from your font stack. We don't need to use those anymore. They're only causing problems for people out in the wild. But for content fonts, this is kind of what we end up with, right? We have our WAF2 format, our WAF format, and OpenType. Or TrueType, if you want to use that. And for icon fonts, just to kind of review, if you want IE8 support, I would encourage you to still do that if you're using an icon font. You'll want to add your embedded OpenType as well. So we have our font face block, right? We'll put it on our web page, see what it does, bring up the dev tools. Oh, it doesn't actually do anything. There's no requests captured. Why isn't our font downloaded? Our font face block is there. And browsers are actually pretty smart. So if our font is not used on our page, then it's not downloaded, which is really great behavior. So for example, in Firefox and IE9, if you add a div to your page and has our font face block on it, this will trigger a download. So browsers wait to see if any elements on your page are using that font family before it will initiate a download. And in your WebKits and your blinks, the element actually needs to be non-empty. It actually has to have content, which is, again, really great. So just to kind of review, browsers on the left download with a non-empty attached node. Has to have content there that's using our font. Firefox and IE will download with an empty node, which is fine too, it's still good. IE8 will download every time, which is not a problem, it's just extra weight for IE8 users. And this is what it looks like kind of in JavaScript, kind of describe the process. We create a div, we assign our font family, we append the div to our document body, which initiates a download in Firefox and IE9. And in WebKit and Blink, we have to actually set and enter HTML on the element before the download will be triggered. So another tool that we can use to further restrict the use cases, or the case in which the font will download, is UNICODE-RANGE. So to learn a little bit about UNICODE-RANGE, we need to know how, like the basic markup of fonts themselves. So fonts actually are made of things called code points, and they're just hexadecimal values that represent characters in our font file. So for example, hex code 26, code point 26 is an ampersand, 41 is uppercase A, and it just continues on the alphabet. And this is what allows us to switch fonts, and our content will still be the same. So we can actually specify these code points in our Unicode range. So inside of our font face block, we'll just add a Unicode range there. And in this example, I'm just using a new font called ampersands for an ampersand character that I want to switch out of my content. So I want regular fallback content, and I want a different font for the ampersand character. So in this content example, I have my new font family, which is should have an ampersand character inside of it. It doesn't actually download if the browser supports Unicode range, because there is no ampersand used in that content. It's actually really great. So if I switch it to use an ampersand, this will trigger a download in browsers that support Unicode range. Android joke. So our ampersand font is used with our ampersand here, and the rest is just our fallback font. So what's the browser support look like for this? So to actually restrict the download, Chrome and Opera are the only browsers that won't download if the content doesn't have our Unicode range character. I just air quoted like Jen did. What is going on here? So yeah, if we're not using an ampersand in Chrome and Opera, the font won't download. Now in all these other browsers on the left, where it says always downloads, it will download your new font every time, but it will actually subset the content, sort of a client-side subsetting, so that it only applies your new font to the characters that use the Unicode range that you specified. And a really important thing down at the bottom right is that if you're using Firefox, it doesn't support Unicode range at all. So one thing to keep in mind is that you need to subset your fonts when you're using Unicode range. So inside your font file itself, you need to only have the ampersand character, or whatever character you want to use in your example, or whatever characters you want to use. Because if you don't do that, Firefox will actually apply all the glyphs inside the downloaded font to all your content. And that's probably not what you want. And if you're not aware of how to subset a font, FontSquirrel has some great tools inside their web font generator. If you go into their advanced settings, you can actually put in your Unicode ranges that you want to use, and it will splice your font into just the glyphs that you want. So we learned a lot about font downloading, how to initiate a download. What happens when our font face request leaves the nest and goes into the wild? This is actually my favorite part of the presentation, just because it's so messed up. Browser behavior is so messed up, sorry. Not the presentation itself. Okay. So what happens when you initiate a download with your font face block on the page is that the fallback, or the content that's using your new web font, so at the top I have some control text that's just using a Times New Roman, which I guess is a super awesome font. It's just a local font. And then below it I'm using a web font with font face. So the content is invisible. It doesn't show up. When the web font loads successfully, it swaps in the new content, makes it visible again, and it renders using the new web font. And we kind of call this the flash of invisible text, or short for FOIT. I'm not sure how you say that, so I just say FOIT. And you can see this in the wild a lot. So for example, I just went to the top 20 on Alexa and went through and saw, found the first one that used a web font, and put it through a web page test to get a nice film strip view. And you could see here that to the right of the icons on the left, there's some missing text. There's also some missing text above that as well. The Facebook logo is an image, so don't kind of ignore that. So for 200 milliseconds, all of that content is invisible. It doesn't show up. The user can't do anything. They can't read it. It's invisible to them. And that was on Chrome with a cable connection, 5 megabit. So not in a mobile world. So this is another example from apple.com. This is when the page first starts rendering, 0.9 seconds. And then at 1.4 seconds, about 500 milliseconds later, it actually pops in its web font. And web fonts here are used for the Hour of Code 2014 and the text below that. The stuff at the top is SVG images, so it's not really applicable to this example. And then 100 milliseconds later, the page, or 200 milliseconds later, the page finishes rendering. So for most of the progressive rendering of our page, there was no content for us to read on the page. Not very usable. So this is that same example using Web Pages Test's 3G, simulated 3G connection. So it first starts rendering at 8 seconds, which is not great, but that's a different problem that we can talk about at a different time. And then at 13 seconds, it pops an image in so that the image successfully loads. And at 16 seconds is when the font actually successfully completes, and our text is visible. So the text is loading about 8 seconds after initial render, and about 4 seconds, 3 or 4 seconds after the image popped in, which is maybe not great if a user is sitting there waiting for the page to load. So in a few browsers, they've tried to kind of work around this issue by adding a timeout. So in Chrome and Firefox, they have a 3-second timeout. And after 3 seconds, if the font hasn't loaded successfully, it will pop in the fallback font, which in this case is Times New Roman. I just used a nice lorem ipsum from a recruiter email I got. So yeah, I'm sure you guys all appreciate that. And then when the font face loads successfully, it will actually swap the fallback font with your new web font. And this is great, right? Because the maximum amount of time the user would have to wait is only 3 seconds before they can read content. And we kind of call this the flash of unstyled text after that 3-second barrier, because the font is readable. It just maybe doesn't look as great as you might want it to look. Or Fout. And Internet Explorer actually, I think, does this the best of all the browsers that I've tested. They use a 0-second timeout. So the fallback is visible immediately. The content is readable immediately. And then whenever the web font loads, whenever that might be, it pops it in, makes it a little bit nicer. So you don't have to wait at all. The page is immediately usable. So this is basically a flash of unstyled text with a 0-second timeout. But for icon fonts, it's completely different, right? So content fonts, we do it one way. Icon fonts, we want to do it a completely different way. So for example, we talked about UNICODE-RANGE a little bit earlier. There is a grouping of code points called the private use area. Now, most Unicode code points have some sort of semantic value associated with them. Inside the private use area, it's kind of a free-for-all. Anybody can put whatever they want in there. There's no definitions at all. And it's part of the Unicode standard just to allow people to sort of customize it to what they want it to be. So you should be free to put whatever you want in there. It's the perfect area to put your icon font glyphs inside of. But unfortunately, some browsers have already assigned default characters inside of this private use area. So you might imagine that if you have a flash of unstyled text in these browsers, it's going to show the fallback character. So for example, in Chrome and Safari, they use just a normal black-looking black box. And on mobile Safari, they actually include some emoji characters, which is interesting. And again, Internet Explorer does this right, because they've completely blanked out their entire private use area. There are no default glyphs there. So here's an example of this in the wild. You're sitting at the airport, you see a nice baseball on a button at the top of the page. What does that button do? Then you got lipstick down here at the bottom. You got a thumbs up on the left. I don't know. I guess I could just click it and find out. But here's another example from GitHub. And I can tell what browser he's using based on the fallback character that's shown here. This is Firefox. And Firefox will actually show you the code point inside of the the little box that it shows, which is nice for developers, but I'm sure very confusing for users. So Reginald, the guy that took this screenshot that was completely unrelated to ICONFONTS, he was complaining about some sort of open source drama that was happening. But he took the screenshot, obviously, 3 seconds after the page had loaded. The icon font hadn't loaded yet successfully, so the fallback font was shown. This is a flash of unstyled text. Another great example, Laura Hogan posted on... Oh, you guys all follow Laura, don't you? She posted this great example on Twitter. She got feedback from a user that says, "Why is there a horse emoji covering up the 5th star of my reviews? It's been like this all day." Now, of course, Etsy fixed this immediately, but one of the great things about Laura is that she immortalized it in cardboard in her window. That's completely amazing. So I just want to do a quick review of Flash of unstyled text and Flash of invisible text because this is so important to understanding how web fonts work. So I'll just go over it one more time real quick. So a flash of invisible text, nothing is shown while the web font is loading successfully. When it comes in, it pops in. For icon fonts, also good because nothing is shown. Or excuse me, content fonts, you don't want it to be invisible. Sorry, let me rewind and start over. OK, so nothing is usable while the font is loading. It's completely invisible. For icon fonts, this is good, right? Because we don't have any fallback characters or weird horse emojis showing while the page is loading. And then we have a flash of unstyled text with a 3-second timeout. Nothing is shown before 3 seconds hits. After 3 seconds, fallback font shows. And then when our web font loads, it pops it in. And then for icon fonts, not great, right? Because at 3 seconds, your fallback font will show. And then when it loads successfully, it will replace with your new icon font. And in Internet Explorer, fallback font is shown immediately. It's great. Replace it with your web font when it loads. That's what you want for content fonts. For icon fonts, they've kind of cheated here because they don't show, they guarantee there will not be any fallback shown in your private use area if you're using the private use area for icon fonts. And so nothing will be shown until the font loads successfully. So it's kind of equivalent to the flash of invisible text if you use the private use area. So when it comes to timeouts, we have 0 seconds for Internet Explorer, 3 seconds for Firefox, Chrome and Opera, blinks, basically. Mobile Safari and Safari, Android, BlackBerry 6, all had who knows how high of a timeout. I tested up to 60 seconds, then I got tired of waiting, so I don't think any user is going to wait more than 60 seconds for your page to load, but maybe, I don't know. So what happens when a request is a runaway HTTP request, your font is going and going and going, and it never comes back? What do you do? Well, intuitively, you might want to hit the stop button. The stop button should show the fallback text, right? No. So you hit the stop button, it does nothing. If your text is invisible, it doesn't show it. So your only recourse in this case is to reload the entire page. Any content that's using your web font, and if that request doesn't complete, you got to reload the entire page. It's horrible. So let's do a mental health check. How's everybody doing? Depressed? Maybe a little bit like this? Maybe sad? Maybe confused? Okay, let's fix some stuff. Make ourselves feel better. Hopefully better than this guy. So our real problem is that we need more control of our flash of invisible text and flash of unstyled text. One of the great APIs for this that's currently available is a JavaScript API, which is very confusing because it's called the CSS font loading API. I know. But it's currently supported in Chrome and Opera. And the syntax kind of looks like this. You just call a load method on your fonts object, pass in the font family, and it has a nice promises API to give you a function that will be triggered when the web font loads successfully. And in this example, all we're doing is adding a new class to our document element that we'll be able to write some CSS to hook into. Now notice that this is very different from a modernizer style approach. We're not just testing for support of font face. We're actually testing that our web font that we're using loads successfully. So it's more robust. And we'll use this CSS to kind of emulate IE8's fallback immediately viewable text. So when our font hasn't loaded, it shows the fallback text, the fallback font family. When the font loads successfully, that class name gets added to the document, and we assign our new font family. So this only works in Chrome and Opera. I actually did write a little bit of a polyfill that you can use. It's called font face onload. It's only 1.5 kilobyte of JavaScript, and it uses the CSS font loading API when it's available. You can also use Typekit's web font loader to do the same kind of class adding mechanism, but it doesn't use the CSS font loading API yet. I think that's in the works. But here's kind of what that syntax looks like. It's very similar. Pass in a font family, add your class name. So this standardizes the behavior across browser on all the browsers that we're testing here. So fallback font family, it loads successfully, that class is added, it repaints using the new font. So when it comes to content fonts, we want to embrace the unstyled text. And since we're more concerned about font fallbacks, I actually wrote a tool that will tell you cross-platform and cross-browser different default font stacks that you can use. So you just put a nice font family in there at the top, and I know Jen kind of alluded to this as well. This is the font family fantasy support, which if you're in the mood for a good laugh, I'd recommend checking that out because it's completely across the board. It's Papyrus and iOS, and what is it? Oh, Impact and Windows. You guys know Impact? It's like two completely different fonts. So if you want to know more about fallback font stacks, definitely check that tool out. So that was a JavaScript API that we kind of went over with the CSS font rendering, or excuse me, CSS font loading API. There's a new CSS property that's kind of being an active specification. I don't know, they're working on it actively right now. A bunch of people from Google are doing this. And if we can get this, it will work a lot better because the rules that we want for our flash of unstyled text and flash of invisible text, we can put right in our font face block. And this is kind of the syntax that they're going with currently. You can set your 0-second timeout for your flash of invisible text and an infinite timeout for our flash of unstyled text. So this is emulating the same behavior that we just went over. But for icon fonts, it's quite a bit different. So this is the syntax you might use with the font face onload utility. It's still basically the same. You got to pass in glyphs so we know what to measure to see if the font is loaded successfully when the CSS font loading API is not available. So you do have to tell it what glyphs to use or what glyphs you're using in your icon font. And we'll use this to kind of work with a supplemental icon font. So again, an icon that's paired with descriptive text. And here's a markup that you might use for that use case. And the CSS is very similar, right? We only set our font family on our icon font and our pseudo element content when the icon font has successfully loaded. So this is what it looks like while it's loading. Nothing shows up, no fallback characters show up, just the text there, and then when it loads successfully, we pop it in. So when it comes to icon fonts, as opposed to content fonts, we want to embrace the flash of invisible text. We don't want those fallback characters to show up. It's a little bit more complicated when you're using standalone fonts, or icon fonts, excuse me. Not quite as intuitive because they don't have descriptive text with them. I'm going to go through a quick example of the hamburger icon. How many people use a hamburger icon on their pages? Quite a few. Have you guys done any usability tests where you've had problems with people understanding what the icon was intended for? Anybody? Some? So here's a nice alternative to that. You can pair it with some menu text right below it. Brett Jankford calls this the hamburger helper. I don't know if you guys have hamburger helper in Canada. Is that a United States thing? Oh. But you could also use a hamburger emoji, right? Get people in on it. You could use a veggie burger. It's just the bun. You could use a gluten-free hamburger. It's just the meat. You could use Facebook's Man Burger. The Hungry Man Burger, the complete meal. That's going to satisfy your users, right? Hamburglar menu. Right? Put the Hamburglar next to that thing. All right, getting serious. Okay, so what happens with this standalone text is we want text to be visible while the font is loading, because if a font doesn't come back successfully, we want something to be usable by the users. So we have this menu text that shows up. This is flash of unstyled text. And then when the icon font successfully loads, we'll pop it in and replace it. So this is the markup that looks like that we'll use for this use case. There's kind of two moving pieces here. We have our separate element for our icon, and we have a separate element for our accessibility text. So the top half of this is very similar to our supplemental icon. The bottom half is different. We have added a bunch of different CSS properties to kind of give it accessibility hide, which is, this text is just ripped right out of HTML5 boilerplate. So it makes the text invisible, but still usable by screen readers. So if a screen reader goes over this element, it will still read menu, which is important for screen readers. But that menu text won't be visible. So in higher Unicode ranges, there's actually glyphs that exist inside of fonts that we can use. So these are local fonts. So for example, the 2261 code point kind of looks like a hamburger menu, right? But it's not. It's a mathematical operator. It has a semantic value associated with it. It means identical to. And we have a star, we have a heart, and we have a Unicode snowman. These all exist in local fonts available on people's systems. So a great tool that John Holt Ripley created, he actually got a bunch of different mobile devices, a bunch of different browsers, and tested these default glyphs to see how well they were supported cross-browser, cross-device. So 2261 is actually one of the most well-supported default glyphs that you can get. So maybe we'll want that to be our text, or our unstyled text that shows while the web font's loading. So that's what this is an example of that. So we want to upgrade a glyph to our font icon. So while it loads successfully, we show this mathematical operator. And then when our icon font loads, then it pops it in. Same markup as the supplemental icon, but the CSS is a little bit different. So we'll use our accessibility hide feature to hide the menu text right at the beginning, so will never be visible, but it'll still be visible to screen readers. We'll show our default glyph, which is our mathematical operator, And then when the icon font successfully loads, we'll replace that with our font family and our new content. And the accessibility of these glyphs, because they have those semantic values, is kind of varied, right? Because when a screen reader encounters this mathematical operator, it reads it aloud as identical to. When it hits a black star, it reads black star. Some of them read just star. And some people have used heart to mean favorite or like, but it reads heart suit aloud, which may not be the most intuitive thing. So what we've kind of used here, and Jen kind of alluded to this a little bit, is that we want to use ARIA hidden to kind of hide this from screen readers. We have our accessibility text here, so it should be fine. We'll just hide the glyph altogether from screen readers. And if you want a little bit more information on these different icon font use cases, for example, there's one on upgrading an image to an icon font. So you have your raster image, and you want to use a vector icon font. You use your image fallback, and then you'll load your font in successfully and replace an image with an icon font. It's not as reliable. It's kind of problematic, so I haven't included that here, and it's a lot of code. If you want to do that, I wouldn't recommend doing that, but if you want to do that, you can check it out on Avant-Garde, Filament Group's repo. So we have these vastly different goals for content fonts and icon fonts. And browser behavior has kind of tried to kill two birds with one stone. They only have one web font behavior, one default web font behavior used for both of these. So we need different tools to manage this behavior so we can make it work better. So we have the CSS font loading API and the new CSS property font rendering to accomplish these tasks so we can standardize the behavior across browser and customize it to how we want it to look to our users. And that's all I got. Thanks. Hey.
Well done. Excellent. Beautiful. Come on, join me.
All right.
That was quite informative, I would say.
Oh,
Pretty
thank
cool.
you.
Lots of stuff. That's
Yeah.
nice. Lots of questions, too. How much time do you spend with fonts?
How much time do I spend with fonts?
Yes.
Uh,
Isn't it too much?
just like
isn't life too
a
short to
super
spend
unhealthy
so much time with
amount
web
of
fonts?
time with fonts, yeah.
Makes you happy?
Well, I mean, the font family tool that I built was a lot of free time. So big thank you to my wife standing over there for giving me all that time to work on it. So yeah, I spend a lot of time with fonts. It's maybe unhealthy, I don't know.
Okay.
But
The thing is, I spend a lot of time with web fonts, too.
okay.
So we had this problem with web fonts loading as well. And it took us quite a while to get it solved. But then in the end, we made it work.
In BlackBerry 6 too?
With local storage and stuff like that. This was interesting.
Okay.
We will talk about it tomorrow anyway. Lots of questions, actually. We don't have that much time, but let me jump right into it. So there seems to be no reason to use SVG in the font stack when you define font face, font family.
Right. Yeah, I would not recommend using those anymore. And Typekit has removed those from their official font stacks as well. And I think more foundries are going to start doing that. So yeah, it only causes problems. So it's kind of complicated because you can now embed SVG inside of fonts. That's a new specification that they're working on right now. So it's Googling about it is not the easiest thing to learn about, but I wouldn't include it in your font family stack for sure, or your font face stack for sure.
Cool. When waiting for web fonts to load, wouldn't it be better to wait for all of them to finish before applying to avoid reflows?
You want to use
So
all your web fonts?
No, I mean if you're using web fonts, and sometimes you have this experience where you have bold being loaded and then italic being loaded and regular. Wouldn't it be better to actually wait? Like this is a question, I guess, to wait for all of them to be loaded and then have the swap.
You're kind of betting the farm in that case. I don't think that you want to put all your eggs in one basket. So the web is kind of born out of progressive rendering. We want to embrace progressive rendering as much as possible. And I think in a lot of tools and utilities that are out there sort of go away from that core methodology. So anytime you can do progressive rendering is good. So if one font completes, you want to render that as quickly as possible. If another one takes another 3 or 4 seconds to finish, you want to render as much as possible and get as much content usable as early in the waterfall as you can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because actually it makes I think a bit more sense to just show the fallback font right away as fast as possible. Then
Unless
the
you're using
question,
icon fonts.
yes,
Yeah.
unless you're using icon fonts. Then the question is, of course, do you have this swap right away, or do you do it on subsequent visits, for example? If you're able to save the font in a cache or local storage or in HTTP cache.
Oh, that's a good point. So yeah, if you
To avoid this flash of unstyled text.
yeah, I mean, well, you have the 3-second timeout. I mean, you can always customize those rules to have your own timeouts internal to the code. You can customize the JavaScript to add a timeout yourself, and that's not a problem. So if you want to add a little bit more buffer, you can do that. Yeah.
Okay.
Is that a
Somebody's
dog?
barking. That's interesting.
Okay.
And also in general, if you're going to use web fonts, there are two options basically. If you can't, use Google fonts, let's say, you can just save fonts. Or you can actually, you're using a corporate font, which is going to be delivered via your server. You can just save the font, either serve it via JSON or base64 encoded CSS, store it in local storage, and then you can actually avoid this delays right away, because this is going to be just retrieved from local storage. It's easy. Or if you're using TypeGit or FontDeck or Cloud Typography or whatever, you would use either your tool or web font loader or stuff like that, right?
Yeah, I mean,
This is kind of the
those
general
approaches will work with any font face block that you put on your website.
Yeah.
So it can be loaded from any third-party source or whatever you want to do. So.
Okay. Another question. Paul Irish asked something. I didn't favorite it. Right. Dear Zach, mobile question. Given the performance and complexity around Void, do you recommend we use web fonts on mobile at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a problem to. So the fastest website is going to have nothing on it, right? So we're balancing between adding additional features that our users will find visually attractive and the performance cost of those features.
Yeah.
So it's always a balance between those two things. But yeah, I think it's still worth it as long as you can do it in a performant way that is robust and handles these sort of use cases when your font doesn't load successfully.
Yeah. So this is also what we tried too, and we actually just included the font face for larger screens. And again, there is no performance hit. So on the mobile screens, the fonts are not loaded. It increased the performance significantly, but then you don't get the fonts at all. So we wanted to have this wonderful typographic consistency across all the views. So we brought it back. I like the answer. It's nice.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't make any assumptions about screen size based on that. I mean, yeah, so that seems like a bad one-to-one.
Yeah.
So if you're, don't do it based on screen size.
Okay, last question from Debbie. Could the font that loads after the fallback somehow fade in so it doesn't blink?
Oh, you can make it fade in, sure. But it would be slower.
Okay, slower in terms of
perceived performance.
Perceived
I mean, you can
performance,
always, you can animate it. You could add a little CSS transition or CSS animation on the font class that gets added to your document. You could certainly do that.
All right.
It'd just be slower.
Okay, lots of really cool stuff in there. People like your hamburger menu and veggie menu and gluten-free menu.
Those are all used with
set up a library
permission
for that?
from, those are all from tweets on Twitter.
Okay,
So
okay, that's good, I guess. All right. Cool, excellent. Thank you,
All right.
Zach. Well done.
Thanks.